of the evening. I'm streaming PowerPoint. I don't know. You guys can probably see it if you click on the live thing. Yeah, you should be able to hover over in Discord where it says live and click, watch streaming. It's not, strictly necessary, but it's very helpful to have a visual sometimes. So without further ado, go ahead and get started because it's 8 p.m. People join, they can join. I already went over this once with a bunch of people. So this is, if you guys missed it the first time or were too drunk because you guys were playing a drinking game, counting how many times I said, this is for you. So in general, I just want to go over the goals in PvP. I'll give you guys a second to get in because some of you guys are still joining and looking at the screen. But in general, obviously, you want to inflict more damage than you receive in any type of combat. Same as this. You might attack a player and it'll say that you lost the attack, so to speak. But if you inflict 300 million damage and only received 100 million damage, it's a victory. You gained 3 times the points than you lost. So if you guys haven't done server versus server before, that's typically what it's going to be. It's actually very rare, at least between big players, that you'll see one big player completely zero another big player. Because usually, as soon as you receive a hit, you're teleporting or moving. But the goal in a battle is just to inflict more damage than you receive. So just keep that in mind when we're discussing conflicts. To start, it's just going over the mechanics of the battle. If you imagine an imaginary battlefield in your head, it's essentially rows that combat takes place on, or columns on a piece of paper, if you will. And the troops start a certain distance apart, but they all start in different starting positions. The chessboard is probably the best example. They all start in different positions in different distances and then move in different ways at different speeds and attack in various ways. So in the beginning, you see ground troops start taking casualties first, and maybe not on a single report, but over many reports, you'll start to notice that if you send in ground troops, they take the most casualties and inflict the most casualties right at the beginning of battle. And the reason for this is because they start the closest in combat. All units start equal distance apart, so ranged both start at the same distance, siege both start at the same distance, etc. But ground troops start the closest, and then when the actual battle starts, they move first, and they move 3 times essentially before combat actually initiates. So they start far closer than any other troop does. So they will take casualties, the most. It's just something to be aware of. Give me a second. Mouth is dry. So cavalry joins shortly after because they have a fast move speed, faster than archers and faster, not as fast as infantry, funny enough. Ebony has funny mechanics about that, but they join pretty soon after. So it's good to be aware that infantry and cavalry are melee, but the next bullet point, ranged and siege, they make ranged attempts, so they can attack over the melee and the cavalry. However, melee troops and cavalry troops, or ground troops, I should say, and cavalry troops, they have to attack at the unit that's right in front of them, and to attack ranged, they have to move closer to them, if that makes sense. So that's why we'll have a slide later on that refers to layers, but that's why layers are important. It's basically defensive troops set up to fight the melee troops while ranged deal damage. Oops. Somebody had a question in Discord, it looks like. So Tipsy, if you hover over where it says live in Discord, and then you can click watch stream or whatever it says, I don't know the exact verbiage, you should be able to pull it up. Let me know if you got it or if you need more help. I can go over it again too. It's pretty simple. But I just wanted to make the concept clear that ground attack essentially first, and then cavalry come in next, and then ranged and siege have to move into position, and then they'll start attacking as well. Did you get it, Tipsy? You can see it now. Okay, great. Get back to that. So that's the concept, is that ground start closest. They'll typically inflict and take casualties first. Let's see who said something. Okay, great guys. Then cavalry join, and then the ranged and siege will start attacking as well. So I just wanted to make that clear. This is a troop attacking order, but I have a better graphic for that later on, which I'll go over. So, and this is that graphic. And Tipsy, I'll answer your question in a second. So troops, as you guys have seen in the in-game interface, have a certain effectiveness. So ranged have a 20% effectiveness on cavalry. Cavalry have, well, I'm just going to arbitrarily say a 20% effectiveness on ground. And then ground have an effectiveness on range. So it's a rock, paper, scissors. Siege is a bit unique because siege only has a bonus against siege, and then it's like a 52% damage modifier against everything else. So technically, this is very technically speaking, siege isn't effective against others. However, you'll see later on it's actually quite effective against ranged. So the troop priorities is an important concept to get behind. You'll see two charts here. One is the actual troop priority, and the bottom one is the realistic troop priority, if you will. The reason I say that is so the top one is what they're coded to do. An example being, if you have a siege unit, and then you have a ground unit, a cavalry unit, a ranged unit, and another siege unit in front of it, and they're all within range, it will prioritize the other siege unit first, then the ranged unit, then the ground unit, then the mounted unit. And then archers, for example, ranged, if they have one of each unit in front of them, they'll first prioritize mounted, then they'll prioritize other ranged units, then they'll prioritize ground, then they'll prioritize siege. So Tipsy, you were asking why this is important. A real life, or quote unquote, real life example, even though it's in the game, is players will build a siege defense. And that's essentially a lot of siege. And the reason it's important to know why these priority characteristics of units is, for example, if you see the enemy has a bunch of siege, let's say 50 million siege units, and you want to attack them with a rally, you don't want to send a bunch of ranged units to attack this guy, because your siege layers are the only layers that are going to be essentially defended, or defensive layers against this siege opponent. Because even if you have a ton of layers in that rally, the defender's siege, as soon as your siege layers are cut through, they're going to start targeting your ranged right away. So your infantry and cavalry layers aren't going to do anything because your ranged are getting cut down immediately by siege. So that's the concept behind knowing this chart, is that you can, even though siege give a limited damage against, let's say, ranged in this example, knowing that the siege will almost immediately start targeting the ranged, your damage is going to get cut down right away. So that's a practical example of why this is useful. Another example is, you'll hear a lot about the tier 1 mounted wall concept. So what that is ranged are pretty good in PvP. So when you have a big range sent coming at you, you know that they're going to be targeting mounted first. So you have high tier mounted troops, let's say tier 14, cavalry. They're going to get cut down first in the battle because the highest damaging unit gets targeted first, and then ranged are going to target mounted. So that's why the concept of ghosting exists. It's essentially because of this chart. Now everybody knows about ghosting, and most people know about the tier 1 wall, but the whys behind it are because ranged is coded to target mounted first. So everybody builds a bunch of tier 1 mounted, and all those archers are sinking their arrows into the tier 1 cavalry, and absorbing the tier 1 cavalry is absorbing the damage, basically. Meanwhile, your archers, your siege, are dealing damage to the enemy attackers, while the attackers are basically killing millions of tier 1 that eat the damage, but don't trade for a good price, because one tier 14 archer is worth easily 100 tier 1 cavalry in a battle. So those are some practical examples. Did that answer your question for the most part? I can find examples and send them to you, but I just want to confirm that cleared up any Any questions about the whys behind it? You can just type yes or no, Tipsy. Somewhat. You want to type what's any more confusion on it, and I can answer it on the slide. And in the meantime, I'm actually going to go grab the mic and stick it in front of me because right now it's far away. Now you guys will probably hear me better. And if anybody else has any questions, feel free to type them as I go. See a bunch of people typing, so I'm kind of just waiting to see what gets said. And if this is too fast, if you guys want me to go back and explain more on each slide, I can do that also. I don't have anywhere to be. Last time it took an hour and a half to get through everything, so there's no rush. The best way to set up layers for defense. It's a little bit pointed. There's very much an it depends on that answer. So it depends on what gets sent at you. Basically, if you have a bunch of tier ones, that's a good example I should have put in. But one of the people in our alliance is built with a bunch of tier ones to absorb range damage. However, because you'll hear a lot of people say tier ones are the best defense, and they are very effective, but you have to have layers and troops to back it up. So this person has 200 million tier one, I think, almost exactly, but then they only have 50,000 tier 12 range, like 50,000 tier 13 range. I think less than that in siege. Very small numbers, we're talking about in the scope of Evany. So they got hit with a big cavalry and big ground march that effectively wiped out their tier ones, because tier ones don't deal a lot of damage. They trade well receiving damage, but they don't trade well most of the time dealing damage without flat refines. So you want to have a tier one wall to absorb damage, but you need to have things to back it up. So ideally you'd have the benchmark is 200 million tier ones. Then after that, 20 million of the next one, tier twos, let's say. And then you don't want to overbuild from there, because a lot of people will build 2, 3, 4 million of each layer onwards, but they don't trade points as efficiently as tier ones. If you were going to do that, you would just, theoretically want to build tier ones. You'll see me later on saying not to overbuild. So the ideal layers are something along the lines of a bunch of tier ones, and then some tier twos, let's say 20 million or 50 million, whatever. And then after that, 100 million of each layer for ground. 100,000, not 100 million. 100,000 of each layer for ground, cavalry, and siege, I would say. Somebody is hot miking. Let me just mute them.
Oops.
But there's an exception with that, and that's ranged. Typically, ranged is very good for defense as well as offense, and the layers will help absorb things and keep your ranged alive. So we're going to get to the concept of layers in a second, but essentially it's troops that absorb damage while your ranged deal the damage. And we'll get into a lot more depth on layers. This is getting a little bit off topic from the slides, but the reason I said it depends is because if you get a bunch of ranged in your defense, you're going to get hit with siege. And Tipsy, this is the example I was giving, is if a bunch of siege is attacking you, they're going to target your siege first, your defensive layers for siege, And then after that, they're going to directly target your range. So you have all these layers, you have the 200 million tier 1 wall, but then it's immediately useless against a siege attack or a rally. And then once they've cleared out all your ranged troops, they're going to send in a ground march or a cavalry march to clear out your tier 1 wall. So then you might want to say, well, I'll build a big siege defense. But the problem with that is that you get rallied by a bunch more siege and they attack your siege directly. So when you do siege defense, you kind of have to go all in on siege. So that's just something to be aware of. Sorry, I know that was a very long-winded answer, but hopefully it answered both of your questions, Tipsy and Bounty. This slide is, I'd say, probably the most important one, because this chart determines really a lot of what happens in Ebony combat. So I already basically discussed this troop march effectiveness, but even though siege does 50-something% against ranged, it's more effective than against range in general because it bypasses layers. So ground, because of its health pool and damage and defense, it's more effective than cavalry at damaging tier 1 layers, tier 1 walls and layers, especially because it fights first. It can start fighting immediately. Certain things have to get into range, and like cavalry range, they have low health pools. They rely on damage. Cavalry isn't the best, but early on especially, it can be useful against tier 1 walls because everybody tends to build cavalry buffs for fighting monsters, but that's just a little side note. Ranged is going to be your best march in general in PvP. Siege is a build you can make, but when you do siege, you really have to go all in on siege. Everything has to be about siege, attack, and HP. You can't really do half measures with siege, because if you build a siege defense, you're going to get rallied with siege. So you have to build more siege, and then there's always a bigger player who has siege. So just be aware, if you did want to go with siege defense, it's pretty good at countering ranged marches, but you will get rallied with siege. And like I said, you really have to go all in. You can't really do I'm going to have a ground march, I'm going to have a ranged march, I'm going to have, this and that. Like your defense generals, everything, it's really you have to focus on siege. So I don't recommend it for starting off, but just so you know, it's an option conceptually. So I'll ask one more time if there's questions. I'll give it 20 seconds if anybody has any, and then move on from there. And in that time, PW, you had your mic on, so I just muted you, but I'll unmute you if you want to mute yourself, just so I can talk in peace. Yeah, it looks like you're muted now, which is good. Well, I don't see any questions, so I'm going to move on. I jumped some topics early, which we're going to have slides to get back into, but this is the layers slide. So there's really two types of layers. There's layers that deal a lot of damage, and ideally those you want to protect. You don't want your damaging layers, like ranged, to be taking hits, because immediately the damage output is going to be decreasing. And as I said in the very first slide, what's the whole reason for combat? You want to deal more damage than you receive. So if your damaging layers are getting hit right away, that's a problem. So it's changed many names over the years, but right now it's known as layers. And those colloquially refer to your absorbing layers, or layers that absorb damage. And the way this is done is we have in our marches, typically 1,000 of each troop. And you'll see this later on in the examples I share, but you'll see 1,000 tier 1s of each type, 1,000 tier 2s of each type going all the way up. And the reason for this is because enemy ranged, for example, they'll start shooting at your cavalry layers right away. So they're not targeting your archers right off the bat, while your archers are dealing damage to whatever troops they happen to have. And this is a lot more effective having all of these layers than not having them. An example being, let's say it's a ranged versus ranged battle inside of one of the temples, or a relic or whatever you happen to be fighting on at the time. What it's going to look like is you have let's say 12 other tiers of troops in your layers, 1,000 of each times 4, that's 48,000 troops that aren't archers. But what's going to happen is if you're fighting enemy archers, they might have 40,000 more of that tier of, archer, but you're going to be dealing damage to those archers constantly, whereas they're going to attack once, wipe out one layer, you deal a ton of damage to them. They're going to attack once, wipe out another 1,000 soldiers, you'll deal a ton more damage to them. That's the concept behind layers in an offensive march, is that you're essentially wasting hundreds of thousands of arrows of that ranged attack on nothing. They're distraction troops. So in every march you send, and like I said, you'll see examples of this later on. You want to send layers, typically 500 to 1,000, depending on your march size. And then after that, let me get a drink of water really quick. Does anybody have any questions on layers? The whys behind it, how this works? Because you'll see if you send just your highest tier troops, you'll take a ton of damage and get very little in return. Talking makes me thirsty. So Aurora, I see you typing. I'll wait to hear what you have to say and answer that before moving on. And there's no rush. I don't mind the quiet. Oh, Rainmaker, I'm glad to see you joined. I really like your name, by the way. I like the rain in general. Fun fact. Oh, okay, no worries. Rainmaker, if you have a question, though, I'm happy to answer. We're all here to learn, and it might be something somebody doesn't know, so. So maybe I should have put that definition in there. A march is the group of soldiers you send to attack. So the march is your 2 generals, assuming you have generals in your march. And then the layers are the different tiers of soldiers in that march. So we're going to skip all the way down to here and I'll explain this better. So you see this report, you're looking at the defender's troops. This is in Battlefield. It's just an example I'll be showing later. The defender, if you look at his troops, this is all of the troops he had in his keep. So he had, X amount of tier 13 soldiers, X amount of, tier 13 or 12 soldiers, can't read, X amount of tier 11. But that's all he had the tier 10 siege, some tier 11 stuff, some tier 12 stuff, and 1 tier 13 stuff. So each tier and each type of troop is a layer when I say layer. And then the march would be all of these troops together going somewhere to attack. To answer the question on the actually, I'll leave it here if you have any questions on this first. Okay, great. So that's what when I say layers, that's what I mean. But when people say layers, typically they're referring to defensive layers or layers that absorb damage. In this example, the guy really didn't have layers. He had, tab back over there. He had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. He had 8 types of troops on the battlefield, plus his traps, but those don't really count as soldiers. So, but you'll see when people send marches, they'll have 1,000 tier 1s of each type. So that's 4,000 troops, 1,000 tier 2s. And so when the opponent attacks, that's why this player, if you see on the left, I won't say his name, but I blacked out all the people on our server. The player on the left had 51 million power. And I guarantee his attack is like his actual troops only having 435,000. He probably only sent 40 million or 30 million power in actual soldiers to attack, but he inflicted 66 million damage in soldiers. So The reason this happened is because if you see all of these tier 13 ground, tier 13 mounted, they're attacking, but they're only damaging layers. So the tier 13 ground will attack with all, it looks like he had 184,000 before they got wounded. They attack with all of those, but they're only going to attack 1,000 soldiers at a time because they can only attack the closest soldiers, and that would be ground or cavalry, depending on whatever the attacking player sent. And keep in mind, you're looking at the defending player's forces. So they're killing 1,000 soldiers at a time, but while they're doing this, the enemy is raining hell down upon them. Like you see these cavalry, right? The reason the cavalry inflicted so much less damage, despite the fact that there were 542,000, is because they attacked the layer, but because the cavalry get targeted first by archers, they got mowed into by all of this guy's archers, and there were no layers to defend the cavalry. Yeah, I mean, cavalry, it's the highest tier cavalry takes the most damage anyways. So, because that's how attacks work, is the highest tier or highest damage dealing unit gets attacked first in that tier. But you don't, that's a bit much for this lesson. So the cavalry got pummeled right off the bat. They have a low health pool. There's nothing to absorb damage. So they got destroyed right away. The infantry are better at frontline fighting because they have a higher health pool. You can see they dealt some more damage, but they still got destroyed right away. And the reason for this is because you don't see any layers in this whole thing at all. So the infantry would have gotten targeted later on if there were more cavalry layers, because this attacker sent archers, and as we established, archers attack cavalry first, right? They attack mounted first. We use mounted in game more. So these ground would have been safe if you saw a lot more lower tier cavalry on here, like the tier 1 wall that I was describing. But instead, there were no lower tier cavalry, meaning like, tier 8, 9, 10, 11. So instead of after the archers cleared out all those cavalry, they immediately started working on, I already forgot the order that it goes, but the siege died right away. Then they started working on these ground. So this player suffered so much damage because all of his troops' attacks were attacking only 1,000 soldiers at a time, but he didn't have layers, so the attacker's troops were just laying into his high tier troops right off the bat. So immediately his potential for damage goes down, while the damage inflicted on the attacker is next to none because he's only going through layers. Does that make sense, Rainmaker? I hope, and everybody else, I hope this served as a pretty good practical example. So my highest tier is tier 12 from there. So, okay, I'll go back to the slide now, because let me go back to that slide that we were on. I just needed a, physical example to show.